welcome back on Daily Debrief, your primer on international news brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya, and for our first episode of the year, we come to you in the midst of another COVID-19 wave in India, which has forced us to leave the studios temporarily and record the show online. So today, we'll be talking from boxes on the latest developments in Sudan, the trial of Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, and what the latest data tells us about Omicron. First, we'll be talking about Sudan, where Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok resigned on Sunday, marking the end of a controversial month and a half in power. As we have mentioned on the show before, Hamdok was deposed during the military coup of October 25, but was reinstated following a deal with the generals. However, the deal was immensely unpopular and massive protests continued on the streets, peaking in December. We have with us Prashant to discuss more on this issue. Prashant, to begin with, could you give us some further context on Hamdok's resignation?
Right. So, Pragya, as you said, the Hamdok was reinstated in November after a deal with the military. And it's important to note that from the very beginning, this deal was immensely unpopular, again, like you said, because all sections of the street, and we've talked about this, all sections of Sudan's political spectrum actually felt that Hamdok had basically betrayed the Sudanese revolution. So, for instance, even his old supporters in what was called the Forces for Freedom and Change, which were centrist, liberal, right-wing parties, all of these together, they felt that, because they themselves were excluded from the power sharing agreement, new power sharing agreement, they felt that there had been a betrayal and they were not keen to support Hamdok. And more importantly, I think the protesters on the streets of Sudan, the people who had driven the Sudanese revolution from December 2018 onwards, the people who were responsible finally for the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir in April 2019, the people who sat through around the military's headquarters, the people whose fellow protesters were killed, whose bodies were thrown into the river, these people under various organizations, the Sudanese Professionals Association, the Neighborhood Resistance Committees, all of them were implacably opposed to the idea that there could be some kind of a agreement with the military after the coup of October 25th. So what we saw was that, and at that point, Hamdok, of course, said that he was doing this to prevent further bloodshed. But what we see was that the killings and the bloodshed did not stop. In fact, on Sunday, when Abdullah Hamdok resigned, there were 3 deaths, and the total number of people who had died in the post-October 25th protests had alone become 57. This is in addition to, of course, hundreds of people being injured, many people being detained, a state of emergency being imposed, the powers of the Prime Minister being largely curtailed. In fact, one of the key points which was enacted when Hamdok was reinstated in November was that he would be heading what is called a technocratic government. And by technocratic government, we mean a non-political government, right? So that his flexibility had further come down, the military had taken over further powers. So as far as Hamdok was concerned, even what he thought was his limited agenda was not being achieved. And we were, of course, nowhere closer to the larger agenda of the protest being achieved, which is that there would be a full-fledged civilian government in power, that the military would leave not only governance, but also its massive stranglehold over the economy. None of this was even close to being achieved. So I think what we saw was that an end of an experiment which is bound to happen, and this is what many of the protesting organizations, for instance, the Sudanese Communist Party, many of these organizations have said that from the very beginning, it was clear that, this was a compromise which was not bound to last, because there was really no chance for success. There was really no chance for any of what Hamdok had promised to be achieved. And it was only clearer by the day that the military's repression would continue, that the military would go on concentrating more power. So I think it was pretty much writing on the wall that Hamdok would resign, and thus he has.
Prashant, what does this mean for the future of Sudan? There's been a months-long standoff between the protesters and the military. What can we expect going forward?
Right, Pragya. So right now, actually, there's a considerable bit of uncertainty. And I think 2 or 3 things are pretty much clear. One, the fact that this is ultimately nonetheless a setback for the military, because we need to understand that it was easy having Hamdok in power because the international community was willing to accept this. The United Nations, other agencies, the United States, all these powers, despite knowing the fact that Hamdok was pretty much a figurehead, just more or less used to prop up, act as a veil for a military controlled government. Despite this fact, the United Nations and other international agencies and the US and the Western powers were willing to accept this compromise. And now it's important to note that that fig leaf has now pretty much disappeared, because even if they get a fresh figurehead, civilian figurehead to sort of head the government, it is not going to be as credible as far as the international community is concerned. So there definitely, Sudan's military regime actually has a huge challenge in terms of that aspect, specifically in terms of the international pressure they're going to face. That's point number one. Now, point number two is the fact that I think, as far as say the protests on the streets are concerned, it's definitely going to intensify, because I think for the protesters, for the forces on the ground, this would in some ways definitely be seen as a victory, because they have steadily, like I said, rejected this coup of October 25th and any deal that has followed after that. So while they do not consider Hamdok to be they may not consider him to have been a major rival or anything, and they would have seen his actions as a betrayal. Nonetheless, the fact that he was forced to step down, in fact, strengthens the legitimacy of these protests, strengthens the demands on the streets. So definitely what we are going to see is that the protests are absolutely going to intensify. Now, the third question really also is the question of whether there is a possibility of what the military is going to do next is really the question, because how long can they sort of not address this demand of full civilian rule? And unlike in many other countries where after we've talked about this before, unlike in other countries where the dictators were overthrown, the civilian government was in power for a brief time and then the military comes back to power. Unlike that situation, in Sudan, the military does not really have an easy path because of the protests on the street. So I think it's really going to be a very tough question for the military. There is only so much repression they can unleash, because with each bout of repression, the protests go stronger. The protesters now, I think, there's likely to be far more unity among the protesters, a far more common cause, so to speak. And now the military, has very little options in terms of, say, flexibility. So I think the key question of how they're going to deal with the demand for full civilian representation is very much going to be a concern.
All right, Prashant, thank you for that. Our next story is from the United States, where Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of the biotech company Theranos, was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud on Monday. Holmes had raised hundreds of millions of dollars promising a device which, with a few drops of blood, would test for a wide variety of diseases from cancer to diabetes. However, the truth was that her technology didn't work, and she soon faced a number of cases. Her sentence is yet to be determined, but she could spend years in jail, although it is expected that she will appeal the decision. Prashant earlier spoke to NewsClick's Prabir Purkais on this topic.
Prabir, thank you so much for joining us. So, very interesting verdict at the conclusion of what has been a very interesting and illustrative case. We saw Elizabeth Holmes, who was actually called as the next Steve Jobs. She was feted by, politicians, billionaires, investors across the world. At the very young age of 30, she was a billionaire. But what ultimately came out was, a whole package of fraud, so to speak, in terms of, and a whole ecosystem of fraud, the way she sold her claims. So could you maybe first take us through some of the salient aspects of the case itself?
Well, Theranos had become a $1 billion, I think at the end of it, was a $10 billion company. $9 billion is what it was valued at. And all of this was built, as we now know, on as really house of cards or built on sand, whatever you want to call it. So the basis of what she was selling was extremely flimsy, and most of it was manufactured artificially by she, her partner, Balwani, and a few of her associates. All of them sold the dream that you just need to have a pinprick, a couple of drops of blood, and with that, any diagnostics could be run. You could run a set of tests only on that. You didn't really need to do what we all do. Whenever we have a test, you have to put a needle in your vein, take significant amounts of blood, meaning about this much amount of blood, and not what she was showing as a non-tainer. And there's a picture of the non-tainer that you can see, which is just a couple of drops of blood in a very small glass vessel. Now, all of that was built essentially what is very common in Silicon Valley, and that's something which all the software companies and as well as the hardware companies have done, which is claim results that you think you will do in a few years' time. Based on that, raise the money and then put in the effort to develop what you claim you have. Now, all of it is what is called fake it before you make it. That's the slogan of Silicon Valley. It's supposed to be. And of course, the fact that it has been successful in many cases, it does not mean essentially that this is not what happens. And a lot of the claims are obviously do not bear out or really do not have anything to back it. Finally, they collapse. In this particular case, the argument was not that it is fraud to make these claims, sell it in the market. It is not fraud if you make all these claims to newspapers and so on, but it's a fraud if you go to an investor and tell them this and manufacture fraudulent evidence. The last part is the critical one, that she produced documents and other things which seemed to have been manufactured by her, and that was what was proved in the court case. So it is fraud to take money from your investors based on false claims. But it is not fraud to sell it on the market, because there are millions of people who have got this test. Those test results seem to have been, most of them seems to have been very erratic, if not wrong. She claimed that she did it using their tools and technology, but it was seen later that it was really done by equipment which was bought from others, conventional ones. She diluted the blood to take that little amount of blood and get a larger volume, which itself, of course, creates problems of wrong results. The results that she supplied, or her company supplied, a lot of them were wrong. In fact, very large numbers of wrong results were given. None of this was established as fraud, by the way. In fact, the fraud is not that she defrauded patients with false claims. The fraud that she took money. So the real issue is she took money from investors. So the real issue in capitalism, at least the Silicon Valley variety or the American variety, is it's wrong to defraud investors. It's all right to defraud all the others. And that is an unfortunate conclusion that is also there in this particular case, that what we are seeing is that it is a fraud if we do it to investors, but it is all right if we do it to the general public. So, that message which has come through of what is fraud and what is not, therefore, it's not a very nice one at the end of the day. All of this, there is a dark side to it as well, that what was not concluded is, what was not proved was that she defrauded patients with fraudulent tests. The other part of it is that, we a lot of suckers are born every day, so that people bought into these claims. The science of it was so flimsy, people still bought into it. Turtlenecks were enough to convince people that she was the next Steve Jobs. She was 19 years old when she started on this path, and she had basically nothing to back all this up. Of course, neither did Steve Jobs, but he had at least a imagination, drive, and he had a technical team, as you know. Wozniak was really the tech person behind it. In this case, Balwani also came from a very different background. He had some software background, but he really had no background of biology whatsoever. So all of this put together meant that really they sold a dream, sold it rather successfully. And if she hadn't gone beyond a certain point and really done straightforward fraud, printing documents with stamp of different companies, claiming that they had also certified her results. If she hadn't done that, she would have actually got off. And this is what the law seems to be. So yes, I think funny that you could make these claims for about 10 years and really make a bigger than life picture for yourself. And at the end of it, a rather unfortunate result that we see.
Right, Prabir, in this context, quickly also, do you think at least some media reports are saying this is a wake-up call to Silicon Valley, etc., etc.? Do you think that anything is likely to change in the model, the fake it till you make it model that you were talking about?
No, because actually make it till you fake it works as long as you don't lie to your investors. You tell them, these are my results, this is what I've done, I think this we will do. You can make all claims you want, but just don't fraud your results. Don't fraud what you show your investors. The rest of the people, it doesn't matter. It seems that you can oversell to the customers. And that I have not understood what's the implication of law, because I don't, I have not really looked at the case in detail. So we can only conclude that at the end of it, the fact that millions of tests were conducted on machines which did not deliver and gave wrong results, that did not lead to a conviction. Those charges did not stick. What stuck was finally that she manufactured wrong evidence. There's evidence to say that she lied to her investors, and that apparently is a cardinal sin in American capitalism. Otherwise, a sucker is born every minute. That's perfectly okay, as long as they're just customers, they're not investors.
Thank you so much, Prabir, for talking to us.
And finally, COVID-19 cases are soaring across the world. A number of countries are reporting record number of cases, ranging from Australia to the United States, which have cited over 1 million new cases. Authorities are hurrying to impose restrictions. Immunologist Dr. Satyajit Rath explained some of the dimensions of the latest wave.
We're looking at this week's progress in the various facets of the COVID-19 pandemic. And a couple of trends have now steadily emerged. The first is that the Omicron variant, which has been spreading in patch by growing patch across the world, clearly has the capacity to spread much more rapidly than previous variants or previous virus strains. In fact, when the Omicron strain begins growing in a neighborhood or in a community, numbers tend to skyrocket. This has been true in South Africa, it has been true in the United Kingdom, it has been true in the US, it has been true across the world in a number of places where Omicron local community transmission has taken hold. The interesting finding that has gotten steadily more and more reinforced from South Africa is that after the first extraordinarily rapid rise in case numbers, particularly in Gauteng province, case numbers have slowly declined, not exactly at the same rapid rate, but fairly rapidly. The Omicron case numbers have declined. Whether this is going to be true of other Omicron outbreaks or not, in the UK, for example, or in the United States, or in South Korea, in Canada, remains to be seen. We've had some fall in case numbers in European and North American countries, but it's quite possible that that is in part explained by smaller test numbers because of the holiday season. The test percentage positivity rates have steadily increased. So the jury is still out on whether they will follow the South African trend of falling case numbers. So the question has always been, again, building on South African numbers, whether the Omicron strain actually is much more likely to cause mild illness and much less likely to cause severe illness. That's what the South African initial data began to show, and that's what the South African numbers have continued to show. Increasingly across Europe and North America, this has again been the case. Hospitalization numbers, although they have risen, have not risen anywhere at the same rate at which infection numbers have risen, saying again that the Omicron strain is causing severe illness in far fewer proportions of cases. There are possibly two separate and non-exclusive reasons for this. One is that the Omicron strain is capable of reinfecting people who have already been infected earlier with earlier strains, and is also capable to some extent of infecting vaccinated people. And yet, in both these categories, it's quite likely that illness due to the Omicron strain remains relatively mild. This would mean that it's not so much that the Omicron strain has become mild, it's just that the people in whom Omicron is spreading have become a little more resistant, and therefore severe illness in them has become less in proportion. This is quite plausible and likely to be true. But the other component of these reasons is that it's possible that the Omicron strain is actually biologically sufficiently altered so that it doesn't cause severe illness as frequently. And over the past week, 10 days, evidence has emerged from a wide variety of scientific groups across the world, starting with researchers from Hong Kong and from European, Japanese, North American research groups, suggesting that the Omicron strain may in fact be less likely to cause severe illness. And that evidence is therefore quite interesting. The evidence is in two parts. Number one, the Omicron strain seems to infect the upper airway tubes, the nose, the throat, the upper parts of the lung airways, much more than way down into the lungs. And yet, severity of illness is caused by infection lower down in the lungs. And that shift, which the Hong Kong researchers have shown, may in part contribute to Omicron causing relatively milder illness. Now, why exactly does the Omicron strain show this disparity between upper airways and lower airways is not yet clear. There are interesting possibilities being discussed, but none of that has been clarified as yet. And finally, the other researchers have shown in animal models, in genetically altered mouse models which are susceptible to COVID, or in Syrian hamster animals which are susceptible to COVID naturally, in both of them, the Omicron strain causes relatively far more mild illness in these animals than the earlier SARS-CoV-2 variants do.
That's all we have on Daily Debrief today. Do come back to us tomorrow. Please keep watching People's Dispatch and follow us and like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you.